I've always considered myself a creature of habit. Waking up at 7, a cup of strong black coffee with a teaspoon of sugar, a short jog along the alley, silence at home while my son is still asleep, and my husband. My husband has long since left for work. Work has always been more important to him, and I stopped arguing about it a long time ago. My whole day is structured like clockwork. Lessons at school, where I teach literature, lunch breaks with colleagues, small talk about trivial matters, returning home to silence, and only rare attempts by my son to elicit interest in his life from me. He's a teenager, and it's tough for him. I try to be at least part of the support he needs, but sometimes it feels like there's a wall between us. A cold, unyielding wall. That day, it all began with something trivial. A broken printer in the teacher's lounge. I stood there, staring at the blinking red light, trying not to lose my temper. Behind me a voice said, "Let me try." I turned around and saw him. Alexei, the new history teacher, tall, a bit lanky with messy chestnut hair. His eyes held a friendly smile, and in his hands was a mug of tea with a thin trail of steam rising from it. "Thanks, but I've already been trying to fix this for 10 minutes, I said, feeling a hint of irritation. However, he didn't back off. "All the more reason to see it as a challenge," he replied with a grin, and stepped up beside me. Within a couple of minutes, the printer came to life, emitting a low whirring sound. I couldn't help but laugh. The laugh came out nervous, a bit louder than it should have been. Alexei looked at me with interest, but didn't say anything unnecessary. We parted as if it had been just a casual encounter. But for the rest of the day, I kept catching myself thinking about his smile. The days dragged on, but Alexei started appearing in my field of vision more often than I had expected. At lunch, he sometimes sat across from me, sharing something funny with the colleagues. His voice was deep and velvety, and I couldn't help but listen. One day he spoke to me directly. "Anna Sergeyevna, you love literature, don't you? How do you feel about history?" I looked up from my cup of tea. His gaze was focused, as if my answer mattered more than I could have imagined. "History is the context for everything that happens to us now," I said. "It's important, but it's often used as an excuse rather than a lesson." "Beautifully said," he replied, and I felt a warm wave touch my cheeks. Where did this embarrassment come from? At home, everything was as usual. My son stayed in his room, absorbed in his games. My husband called late in the evening, dryly asking how my day went, and I answered just as dryly. Our conversations had long since become mere formalities. Yet for some reason, before going to sleep, I thought again about Alexei's voice, his gaze. It was ridiculous. He was just a new colleague, nothing more. And yet, I fell asleep with his image in my mind. The next morning brought another meeting. Alexei happened to be in the hallway when I was gathering books from my locker. He stopped to help pick up a volume that had slipped from my hands. His fingers brushed against mine, and it was so fleeting that it could have meant nothing. But the air suddenly became charged with a tension that couldn't be ignored. "Rough day?" he asked softly. I nodded without looking up. His voice was too close, too gentle. "If you want a distraction, I have some rare maps in my office today. I could show them to you. They're fascinating." I nodded again, though I wasn't sure why. At that moment, it felt like I just wanted to be near someone who could offer warmth, even if only for a little while. Thus began a thin, barely noticeable thread that connected us. At the time, I didn't know where it would lead. But that day, for the first time in a long while, I felt alive. I can't say when exactly the thread that connected us began to tighten. It wasn't sudden. It was subtle, creeping in with every small interaction, every shared glance, every word that lingered a second too long in the space between us. The day after our brief exchange in the hallway, I found myself standing outside Alexei's office. My hand hesitated on the doorframe as I tried to convince myself that I was there out of pure curiosity. He had mentioned the maps after all. It wasn't as if I was doing anything wrong. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that stepping inside would mean crossing some invisible line. He looked up as I entered, his face lighting up in a way that made my chest tighten. "Anna Sergeyevna, I was hoping you'd come," he said, rising from his chair. "Let me show you." He pulled out a large rolled-up map and spread it across his desk. The parchment was aged, its edges frayed, and the intricate details of the drawn landscapes were mesmerizing. Alexei's enthusiasm was infectious as he traced the lines with his finger, explaining the historical significance of each mark. I found myself drawn in, not just by the map but by the way he spoke, his passion, the spark in his eyes. At one point, he glanced at me and paused as if realizing something. "You're not just interested in literature, are you?" he asked quietly. "You see the stories in everything." I froze, his words catching me off guard. It felt as though he had peeled back a layer of me that I had long kept hidden, even from myself. I managed a small nod, unable to find the right words. "That's rare," he added, his voice soft. "And beautiful." There it was again, that tension, that unspoken connection between us. I quickly looked down at the map, pretending to study it, but I couldn't ignore the way his words lingered, wrapping around me like a delicate thread pulling me closer. Over the next few weeks, our interactions became more frequent. He'd find reasons to pass by my classroom, always with a quick comment or a smile that felt like a private secret shared between us. At lunch, we'd exchange subtle glances, small moments that no one else seemed to notice. Each one felt like a spark, igniting something inside me that I couldn't define. At home, things remained unchanged. My husband was increasingly absent both physically and emotionally. When he was home, our conversations were brief and hollow, filled with routine questions and answers that neither of us truly cared about. My son seemed to sense the growing emptiness, retreating further into his own world. The house felt like a shell, cold and lifeless. It was in that void that Alexei's presence became something I looked forward to, something I needed. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And yet, I couldn't ignore the growing guilt that came with it. One evening, as I was grading papers at my desk, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from Alexei. "I found another map today. Thought you might like it. Want to see it tomorrow? I stared at the screen, my heart racing. A part of me knew I should decline, draw a boundary before things went too far. But another part of me, the part that longed for connection, for warmth, typed out a single word: yes. The next day, I found myself in his office again. This time, the air between us felt heavier, charged with an unspoken understanding. He showed me the map, his voice as animated as ever, but there was something else in his gaze, something that mirrored the conflict swirling inside me. At one point, our hands brushed as we both reached for the map. Neither of us pulled away immediately. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a jolt through me. I glanced up at him, and for a moment, the world outside that small office ceased to exist. "Anna," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. But before he could say anything more, the sound of footsteps in the hallway broke the moment. I quickly stepped back, my face flushing as I fumbled for an excuse to leave. "Thank you for showing me," I said hurriedly, avoiding his gaze. "I should go." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that told me this wasn't over. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. My husband was next to me, his breathing steady and oblivious. I felt like I was being pulled in two directions, caught between the life I had built and the spark of something I couldn't define, but desperately wanted. I told myself it was just a passing infatuation, a momentary escape from the monotony of my life. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. And it terrified me. The days blurred together after that evening. I told myself I wouldn't let things go any further, that I would keep our connection professional, distant. But Alexei had a way of appearing in the most unexpected moments, as if drawn by some invisible thread that neither of us could sever. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. The day had been gray and oppressive, the kind that weighs on you without mercy. I stayed late after school to catch up on grading, but the silence of the building made the air feel thick, suffocating. I needed a distraction. I wandered to the library, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The familiar scent of old books was a comfort, and I let my fingers glide across the spines of the worn volumes, searching for something to anchor my restless mind. That's when I heard his voice. Lost in thought again? I turned to see Alexei standing in the doorway, a stack of books balanced in his arms. His expression was warm, his eyes filled with that quiet curiosity I had come to expect. "Just looking for something to read," I replied, my voice steady. What about you? He stepped closer, placing the books on a nearby table. Research. My students are preparing projects on the Napoleonic Wars. He paused, then added with a smile, but I think I'd rather hear your thoughts on poetry than read another essay about military strategy. I laughed softly, the sound startling in the stillness of the library. I'm not sure my thoughts would be very helpful for your class. Maybe not for the class, he said, his tone lower now. But they'd be helpful for me. There it was again, that charged moment, the unspoken connection that seemed to grow stronger every time we were alone. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked at him, torn between the desire to stay and the need to leave. I don't remember how long we stood there, the silence between us louder than any words. Eventually, I mumbled an excuse about needing to get home and left the library in a rush. But the encounter lingered with me, replaying in my mind like a film I couldn't stop watching. At home, the tension followed me. My husband was sitting in the living room when I walked in, his face buried in his phone. He barely looked up to acknowledge my presence. You're late, he said, his tone indifferent. Grading papers, I replied curtly, heading to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of water. The weight of his disinterest pressed on me, making the air feel heavier. I thought about telling him how I really felt, how lonely I had become in this marriage. But the words caught in my throat, the effort too great for a conversation that I knew would go nowhere. The following day I avoided Alexei. I kept to my classroom, skipped lunch in the staff room, and ignored the flutter of anticipation every time I heard footsteps in the hallway. But fate seemed to have other plans. As I was gathering my things at the end of the day, he appeared at my door. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. Are you avoiding me? The directness of his question caught me off guard. I hesitated, then shook my head. No. I've just been busy. Busy, he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. Anna, if I've crossed a line. You haven't, I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I softened my tone and added, it's not you. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. His gaze softened and he stepped closer. Neither do I. But I know that being around you makes me feel alive. And I think you feel the same. The honesty in his words was disarming. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But the truth was I did feel alive when I was with him. And that terrified me. That night I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. The house was dark, my son's window glowing faintly with the light from his computer screen. My husband's car was in the driveway, but the thought of seeing him felt like facing a stranger. I stayed in the car, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked tired, the lines around my eyes more pronounced than I remembered. But there was something else in my expression, a glimmer of something I couldn't quite name. Hope? Fear? Desire? Maybe all three. Eventually I went inside, the familiar silence swallowing me whole. But for the first time it didn't feel as suffocating. It felt like a choice, one I wasn't sure I would keep making. The thread between Alexei and me wasn't just tightening, it was becoming unbreakable. And I didn't know if I had the strength to cut it. It started to show, the cracks in the delicate mask I had been wearing. At first I convinced myself it was subtle, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But I underestimated how closely Alexei was watching. The next week brought a school event, a formal gathering of teachers, parents, and students to celebrate the semester's achievements. The gymnasium had been transformed, draped in lights and banners, with tables set neatly in rows. It was an evening of polite applause and small talk, the kind of event where everyone plays their role to perfection. I arrived late, my dress a last-minute choice from the back of my closet. The moment I stepped inside, I felt his presence before I even saw him. Alexei was standing by the refreshments table, engaged in conversation with another teacher. He looked up as I entered, his gaze finding me as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Our eyes met across the room. It was fleeting, just a second too long to be accidental, but no one else seemed to notice. Or so I thought. The evening dragged on in a haze of polite conversations and forced smiles. I was speaking with a group of parents when I felt someone approach from behind. Turning, I found Alexei standing there, a glass of sparkling water in hand. Anna Sergeyevna, he said with a small smile. May I borrow you for a moment? The parents murmured their goodbyes as I nodded, following him to the quieter side of the room. He handed me the glass, his fingers brushing mine for the briefest moment. You looked like you could use an escape, he said, his voice low. You're not wrong, I replied, taking a sip and glancing around the room. It's all so much. You've always seemed a bit out of place at these things, he observed, his tone gentle. Not because you don't belong, but because you see through it. His words hung in the air between us, their weight sinking deep into my chest. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, a voice called out behind us. Anna, there you are. I turned to see my husband approaching, his smile tight and his eyes scanning Alexei with thinly veiled suspicion. He reached out to place a hand on my shoulder, the gesture more possessive than affectionate. And you are? He asked Alexei, his tone polite but firm. Alexei Ivanovich, Alexei replied smoothly, extending a hand. I teach history here. Ah, a colleague, my husband said, shaking his hand briefly before turning to me. We should head home soon. It's getting late. I nodded, feeling the tension in the air like a cord pulled taut. Alexei stepped back, his expression unreadable. Of course, he said with a small nod. It was nice to meet you. As my husband guided me toward the exit, I glanced back over my shoulder. Alexei was still standing there, his eyes fixed on me, a shadow of something unspoken lingering between us. That night, my husband's mood was colder than usual. As we got ready for bed, he spoke without looking at me. You seemed friendly with that history teacher. The accusation in his voice was subtle, but it was there. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. He's a colleague. We were just talking. Talking, he repeated, his tone clipped. You've been spending a lot of time at school lately. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the dresser. I have work to do. You know that. Work, he muttered, shaking his head. Sure. The conversation ended there, but the unease lingered. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, the silence of the room broken only by his steady breathing. My mind raced with thoughts of Alexei, of the way he looked at me, the way he made me feel seen. And then there was the guilt, coiling around my chest like a serpent, tightening with every passing moment. The next day I avoided Alexei again. But this time it wasn't just out of fear of being discovered. It was out of fear of myself. During lunch I stayed in my classroom, grading papers and trying to push him out of my mind. But the harder I tried, the more persistent the thoughts became. Memories of his voice, his gaze, the way he seemed to understand me in a way no one else did. They refused to fade. By the end of the day I was exhausted both mentally and emotionally. I gathered my things and headed to the parking lot, hoping to make a quick escape. But as I reached my car, I heard his voice behind me. Anna. I turned to see Alexei standing there, his expression a mixture of concern and determination. We need to talk, he said. I glanced around, the empty parking lot offering no refuge. Alexei, this isn't a good idea. Maybe not, he admitted, stepping closer. But avoiding me isn't working either. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. Avoiding him wasn't making anything easier. If anything, it was making everything harder. Please, he said, his voice soft. Just 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. I hesitated, the conflict inside me raging like a storm. Finally I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper. 5 minutes. As he stepped closer, the weight of everything unsaid pressed down on me. And I realized that the cracks in my facade were no longer something I could hide. Not from him. Not from myself. Every choice I made seemed to spiral into something I couldn't control. The walls I had built, between Alexei and me, between my family and my real feelings, were crumbling brick by brick. The more I tried to contain the chaos, the more it seeped through, defying my feeble attempts to keep everything intact. After our conversation in the parking lot, I thought I could manage it, draw a line and keep us both from crossing it. But some lines aren't drawn with ink. They're etched in the spaces between us, in the silence that holds 1,000 unspoken words. The following morning the school buzzed with the usual hum of activity, but I felt detached, like I was walking through a world encased in glass. My students' voices blurred, their questions barely registering as I moved through the motions of teaching. I avoided Alexei's gaze during the staff meeting, though I could feel it on me, heavy and searching. But by lunch I found myself standing outside his classroom, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself I just needed to clarify things, to set boundaries we both could follow. The door was ajar, and I stepped inside without knocking. Alexei was sitting at his desk, reading, his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up when he saw me, and for a moment, the tension in the air was palpable. "Anna," he said, setting the book aside. "I wasn't sure if I'd see you today." I closed the door behind me, leaning against it as I crossed my arms over my chest. "We need to talk." "About yesterday?" he asked, his voice careful. "About everything," I replied, my voice firmer than I felt. "Alexei, whatever this is, it has to stop. We can't keep doing this." He stood, his movements deliberate as he approached me. "Doing what, Anna?" "Talking. Existing in the same space. Feeling something we're too scared to name." "Don't," I whispered, shaking my head. "Don't make this harder than it already is." He stopped a few feet away, his hands at his sides, his eyes locked on mine. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't lie awake at night telling myself the same thing? That we need to stop? That it's wrong? Then why don't you?" I snapped, my voice breaking. "Why can't you just leave me alone?" "Because I can't," he said, his voice raw. "Because every time I see you, it's like I finally understand what I've been missing. And I don't know how to go back to pretending I don't feel that." His words hit me like a wave, washing over me and leaving me breathless. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that this was all a mistake. But deep down, I knew he wasn't. I felt it too, the pull, the inevitability of it all. The bell rang, breaking the moment like shattered glass. I stepped back, my hand on the doorknob, desperate to escape before I said something I couldn't take back. "We can't keep meeting like this," I said, my voice trembling. "Someone will notice." "Let them," he said quietly, his gaze steady. "I don't care anymore." I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Finally, I turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind me. But the sound didn't bring the relief I hoped for. Instead, it felt like a prison door closing, locking me into a reality I didn't know how to escape. That evening, I tried to focus on my family, to immerse myself in the routine of dinner and homework and bedtime stories. But my husband's cold demeanor only reminded me of the growing distance between us. He barely spoke, his attention fixed on his phone or the television. And when he did speak, it was to comment on something trivial, his voice devoid of any warmth. As I cleared the table, he glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "You've been distracted lately," he said, his tone more observation than accusation. "I'm tired," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "Work has been a lot." He nodded, not pressing further, but his silence spoke volumes. I could feel the unspoken questions hanging in the air, questions I wasn't ready to answer. Later that night, I sat in the living room long after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt oppressive rather than peaceful. I stared at my phone, Alexei's name hovering in my thoughts like a ghost. Before I could stop myself, I typed a message. "We need to talk." I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity, my finger hovering over the send button. My mind screamed at me to delete it, to walk away, to bury whatever this was before it destroyed everything. But my heart had other plans. I pressed send. The response came almost immediately. "Name the time and place." I closed my eyes, the weight of my decision settling over me. I didn't know what I was doing anymore, only that I couldn't stop. The thread between us wasn't just tightening, it was strangling me. And part of me didn't want to fight it anymore. I barely slept the night after sending that message to Alexei. Every passing second seemed to pull me deeper into an ocean of doubt. But the memory of his immediate reply kept me afloat. "Name the time and place." Those words lingered in my mind like a forbidden mantra, at once thrilling and terrifying. When morning came, I went about my routine mechanically, breakfast, packing lunches, walking my daughter to school. My husband muttered something about working late again. He didn't meet my eyes as he grabbed his briefcase and walked out the door. For once, his distance felt like a relief. By the time I arrived at school, the knot in my stomach had tightened to the point of pain. The hours crawled by, my lessons delivered in a monotone that even I found unbearable. My students exchanged puzzled glances, but no one dared ask what was wrong. I'd agreed to meet Alexei after classes, just outside the school grounds near the old oak tree by the parking lot. It was a place rarely frequented, neutral, quiet. Safe, at least in theory. When the last bell rang, I lingered in my classroom, pretending to organize papers while my heart pounded furiously. Every rational part of me screamed to cancel, to walk away, to forget. But the irrational part, the part that craved something I couldn't name, drove me forward. I stepped outside, the crisp evening air biting at my skin. The oak tree loomed ahead, its gnarled branches casting long shadows across the pavement. Alexei was already there, leaning against the trunk with his hands in his pockets. When he saw me, he straightened, his face lighting up with something that looked dangerously close to hope. "Anna," he said softly. I stopped a few feet away, crossing my arms as if the gesture could shield me from everything that was about to happen. 5 minutes, I reminded him. He nodded, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I know this isn't easy for you. It's not easy for me either. But pretending we can just ignore this, whatever this is, isn't working." I closed my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "Alexei, do you have any idea what you're asking?" "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I just need you to be honest with me. With yourself. Do you feel it too? Or am I completely alone in this?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and it broke something inside me. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. There was no judgment there, no expectation. Just raw vulnerability. "Yes," I whispered, the word escaping before I could stop it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The admission hung between us, fragile and electric. "What do we do now?" he asked finally, his voice barely audible. "Nothing," I said firmly, though my resolve wavered. "We do nothing. This, whatever this is, it can't go anywhere. It would destroy everything." "But it's already destroying you," he countered, his eyes searching mine. "I see it every day. The way you're carrying this weight all alone. Let me help." "Let me." "No," I interrupted, stepping back. "You can't. No one can." The hurt in his eyes was almost too much to bear, but I forced myself to hold my ground. "Anna, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Just let this be. Let me go." I turned and walked away, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached my car, tears blurred my vision. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the steering wheel and trying to steady my breathing. I told myself I had done the right thing. I had drawn the line. But as I drove home, the image of Alexei standing alone beneath the oak tree refused to leave my mind. That night I lay awake in the darkness, the storm inside me raging louder than ever. The line I had drawn felt less like a boundary and more like a wound, one that would never truly heal.